Hello, I'm Dr. John David N., Professor of History at HPU, and this is about decolonization. It's a very important topic in world history, mostly decolonization takes place after World War II. There are some examples before World War II, but this is really a post-World War II kind of mid to late 20th century event. Decolonization, what is it? It's actually when colonies become independent nations. And it can happen a variety of ways. It can happen, the colonizer can leave, the colonized peoples can rise up and start a rebellion. There can be civil war. I mean, this can be a really messy transition. So let's get into it a little bit more by talking about the causes of decolonization first. This is quite important because, of course, when we look at decolonization, the first thing to remember is the Gandhi effect. What I mean by this is Mahatma Gandhi and his role in the eventual independence of India is quite important. And so Gandhi actually was what we call an anti-imperialist nationalist. And what he did is he used the ideas of Western nationalism against the West in creating an attitude of independence in India in the period before World War II. And then, of course, in 1947, the British actually leave India, and so it works out. The other cause here is the Japanese Empire. So the Japanese in the late 19th and early 20th century create what is really a model for how other nations can resist Western imperialism and become strong. And we already studied this part, but Meiji Restoration, modernization in education, industrialization, creating modern political institutions, all pointed at strength and resisting Western imperialism. So other nations look at Japan and they go, oh, that's an interesting model for how we could do anti-imperialism and throw off Western imperialists. Okay, so the other thing about Japan is they are actually an imperialist, and during World War II they extend their power to Southeast Asia, to places like Indonesia, Burma, and in Vietnam, and so those places, what Japan does is it throws out European imperialists, and then after the war, the European imperialists find it much more difficult to come back into power. So in some ways, the Japanese act as liberators, even though when they're there, they treat the subject peoples like terrible, like victims. I mean, they're really nasty to some of these people. So, okay, and then the other thing, the third important cause is Western weakness. And this is taking place over, the first half of the 20th century. And it's really about World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression, those three things. So, and World War I, why is this a cause? Because what it does is it weakens the West materially. It weakens the major European empires quite a bit. I mean, they have to spend a lot of money to fight this war. And they're poorer afterwards. They can't manage their empires as well. And they don't have troops available to send to their empires. This is just reality. And then the other part is that the European powers, the European people think they're superior to racially, essentially, or civilizationally as well. They give this out in the late 19th century. We're superior to you, and we'll teach you how to do civilization. And in World War I, then the colonized peoples look at what's happening in Europe and they go, oh, well, these people are not superior to us. They're doing awful things to their own people. They're killing millions of their own, the other combatants' people. And so this kind of puts the lie to European, cultural or racial superiority. And that's also important because that gives these colonized people motivation. They say, okay, we're actually capable of this. Okay, now, how did the superpowers play out? Because, of course, after World War II, you have the Cold War and you have the Soviet Union and the United States. And so how do those two powers think in terms of decolonization? Well, both powers actually support decolonization. In fact, during World War II, the United States sends an army to North Africa And when it's there, they're actually promoting the idea of African independence and more African forms of self-representation. In the Soviet Union, it's kind of built into Marxist ideology in the Soviet Union, especially Leninism. Vladimir Lenin's idea is that capitalism will founder upon the rocks of imperialism. It will expand so much that it will use up all the resources of the world, and it will destroy itself. And these empires will collapse. So both nations have this idea that decolonization is a good idea. They have kind of very different approaches, of course. One is capitalist, one is communist. They both also, when decolonization takes place in Southeast Asia and Africa, they both funnel money into these new nations, and they funnel money for projects like dams and bridges and roads and this kind of thing. And so they're actually they're forwarding these new nations, and the new nations actually become kind of part of the Cold War, where nations aligned with the U.S., other new nations aligned with the Soviet Union. So you have that kind of development as well. Okay, so then there's some other ways of thinking about decolonization, and one of them is settler versus non-settler. Settler versus non-settler. India is a non-settler colony because the British do not settle many of their own in India. Vietnam is a settler colony because the French settle large parts of South Vietnam and become farmers there. Quite lucrative, by the way. And so the difference between those two in terms of decolonization is that non-settler colonies are easier to decolonize than settler colonies. These settler colonies, the home nation, like the French in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, they tend to know, we don't want to give this up. This is our land. This is our lives. We lived here for generations. And so they encourage the nation back at home to fight, to try to retain those colonies. And that's what happens in both cases. So we'll talk in a minute about Vietnam and about some cases. And then the other thing is that the French and the British rule very differently in terms of their approach to decolonization. The British think of this in terms of indirect rule. The British don't want to have as much hands-on as the French do. And so they allow limited forms of self-government in their colonies. The French do not. They think of their colonies as directly connected to the nation. And so they have the colonies elect representatives that are sent directly to Paris, to the parliament in Paris, France. And so these are a different approach, and the one is easier to let go of than the other. And once again, it's the British approach is easier to kind of devolve to, to let go of the colony, and the French is much more difficult to let go of this. Okay, so let's talk about Vietnam. Vietnam is one of these decolonization situations. It's probably one of the messiest decolonizations in the history of the world, the post-World War II world. And so the French are in Vietnam. Then during World War II, the Japanese occupy Vietnam, push the French out, or at least to the very southern tip of Vietnam. And then after the Japanese leave, they lose the war at the end of World War II, then the French come back in. But meantime, the Vietnamese people themselves are organizing under a guy named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a revolutionary. Just a couple of minutes about Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is he a patriot or is he a communist? Is he a nationalist or a Marxist? Okay, he's both actually. What motivates him the most is the sense of anti-French nationalism. He gets this growing up. His dad is an anti-French patriot. They want to kick the French out. But then Ho Chi Minh gets exposed to communism in the 1920s, brings it back to Vietnam and founds the Vietnamese Communist Party. But then in 1945, when there is this opening, right? The colonial power is out, the Japanese are out, there's an opening, then Ho Chi Minh declares, hey, we are an all-party kind of organization, and we're declaring the independence of Vietnam. And it's interesting because this happens like in early September 1945, and when he gives this speech, he mentions George Washington, I'm not kidding. And there are American officials on the platform with him when he gives this speech. So at that point, the Americans are thinking, well, maybe this could work. Maybe, we'll ally with Ho Chi Minh. Obviously, that doesn't last very long. A couple years later, the French are fully back into Vietnam, and the Americans, of course, the Cold War starts, and the Americans are actually funding the French effort in Vietnam because the French can't afford it. Okay, early 1950s, the French are losing battles. They lose a big battle in the north, and then they're out. And then there's a peace conference in 1954 that says, hey, we're going to unify Vietnam with a vote, and it doesn't work, and the peace accords really fall apart. The United States gets involved in South Vietnam and supports the leader there. They install a leader, Diem, in the South, and he's kind of corrupt guy, and he really is very unpopular, and he gets into trouble, and then of course shooting war breaks out, and the United States sends in troops in 1964, and into 1965, and they fight a war there, and they lose this war in part because they misunderstand. The United States thinks they're fighting against communism, when in fact, remember Ho Chi Minh, it's both, when in fact it's both. And what's motivating Vietnamese to fight and die is actually their defense of their own country, not communist ideology. Okay, so that's a case, of course, and then the Vietnamese kicked the Americans out in 1973, and take total control in 1975. Okay, one other thing to say about this is that decolonization causes struggles in the colonies, but it also causes this kind of wave of trouble back at home. So what happens after World War II is that many of these European nations, peoples, the population say, we don't want to be colonial powers. We don't want to be empires anymore. It's too expensive. It's too much work. And we think maybe it's a bad idea. It's hegemonic, and we don't like that part of it. And so what happens is political leaders have to adjust, or they lose elections. And in fact, in Great Britain, Winston Churchill is defeated in election because he can't adjust. He still wants an empire. And then in France, Charles de Gaulle, same thing in the 1950s and 60s. He loses support and eventually is driven from office because he doesn't want to give up empire. And so these European powers have to see the new reality that they don't have the resources, and they don't have the popular support anymore to do this kind of thing. Okay, and that helps. That definitely helps. So Southeast Asia is the 1950s, late 1940s, 50s. India, of course, is 1947. Not peaceful, but the British withdrawal is peaceful. The Africa, for instance, is more 1960s to 1980s, and Africa is very complex. But let's just take a couple of cases. For instance, Egypt. Let's take Egypt in North Africa. Egypt is part of the Ottoman Empire in the period before about 1850. They're actually gaining more and more of their own independence in the 1800s. And then the British step into Egypt, take control over Egypt. But then in 1918, the British decide, we're going to begin to step back. They're still in Egypt in World War II, but they're definitely a declining power in Egypt in World War II. There's also Algeria. And of course, Algeria is directly ruled by the French. It's a settler colony. There are French nationals, lots of them in Algeria. So the French do not want to give it up. They consider it a part of their kind of national pride to keep this colony. And so the French put in a lot. And a war starts in 1954 and 56, actually, I think, and it lasts till 1962. And it becomes, these decolonization battles many times devolve into civil wars as well. So that's another difficulty with it. Algeria, of course, eventually gets its independence. One of the legacies of decolonization, we're just going to wrap up here quickly. One of the legacies is that the way empires operated in the 19th and the 20th century is they got a lot of raw materials from these colonies. They brought those raw materials to Europe and the United States. Then they would create finished products with those raw materials. And then they would sell those finished products for, high prices, lots of value in those finished products. The raw materials they paid very little for. And so colonies, especially colonies in Africa, but really other parts of the world as well, they never developed industrially. And so they never were able to see the wealth that the European powers and the United States got from all of these resources. And in some ways, it's really kind of an unfair system. It's what we call the core periphery system. That is still true today, that, less industrialized parts of the world are still, there's still kind of this core periphery thing going on where raw materials come from those parts. They go to the West, they get produced into finished products, and that's where the real wealth is in those finished products. So that's a legacy. The other legacy of decolonization is that the boundaries of these nations that emerge, especially in Africa, were not chosen by Africans. They were chosen by European map makers in the late 19th century. And these boundaries are a problem. Sometimes they'll put rival tribes into the same nation. Sometimes they'll divide in half a tribe put it in two different nations. So this continues to be a big problem as well in terms of the politics of Africa. So decolonization is ongoing. It's very important. The last thing it does is it places immigrants in Europe, and we're going to talk about that next time. Post-World War II immigration to Europe, which is continuing today. Okay, have a good one. Take care.